He thought turning her away would be a small, forgettable moment, but he had no idea he was about to humiliate the one person who could end his career with a single word. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd really appreciate your support. Take a quick moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more powerful and emotional content. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thanks so much for being here. The glass walls of Bennett Luxury Motors reflected the bright California sun, casting sharp lines of light across polished marble floors and rows of vehicles worth more than most homes. Inside, everything gleamed. Chrome finishes, leather interiors, tailored suits. And in the middle of it all stood Claire Bennett, wearing simple jeans, a plain white blouse, and sneakers that had seen better days. She didn't rush, didn't fidget, didn't try to impress anyone. Her eyes moved calmly across the showroom until they settled on a deep metallic gray SUV positioned on a raised platform. Its price tag just over $120,000. There was something almost poetic in the contrast, the quiet woman standing in front of something built to scream status. A young salesman, Ethan Reed, noticed her first. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether she was serious, but then approached with a polite smile that hadn't yet been worn down by the industry. "Good morning, ma'am. Is there anything I can help you with?" His tone was genuine, careful, respectful. Claire returned the smile, soft and steady. "Yes, actually. I'd like to learn more about that SUV and possibly take it for a test drive." The words were simple, but they hung in the air just long enough to catch the attention of someone else. Derek Collins, the showroom manager, turned his head from across the floor. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Claire's appearance from head to toe, not missing a single detail. He adjusted his tie, then walked over with the kind of confidence that came from years of deciding who belonged and who didn't. "I'll handle this," Derek said smoothly, cutting Ethan off before he could respond. The younger man stepped back, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Derek stopped in front of Claire, his smile polished but empty. "That model," he said, gesturing casually toward the SUV, "is typically reserved for clients who schedule in advance." His voice wasn't loud yet, but it carried just enough for nearby customers to start paying attention. Claire didn't react. She simply nodded once. "I understand, but I'm here now. If it's available, I'd still like to see it and take it for a drive." Derek's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. He let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Of course you would." A couple browsing nearby glanced over. The air shifted slightly, tension creeping in like a quiet draft. Derek took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite, but not enough to hide the condescension. "Vehicles in this price range aren't typically demonstrated without proper verification." Claire's expression didn't change. Her posture remained relaxed, her gaze steady. "What kind of verification do you require?" she asked calmly. That was the moment Derek decided to make it public. He straightened, raising his voice just enough for the room to hear. "Ma'am, I think it might be more appropriate if you looked at some of our pre-owned inventory. We have excellent options starting under $30,000. A few people turned fully now. Someone let out a quiet laugh. The room didn't erupt, but it didn't stay neutral either. It tilted. Claire stood there, absorbing it all without a single outward reaction. No embarrassment, no anger, no rush to defend herself. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something shifted that Derek didn't notice. Something quiet, but irreversible. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and uncomfortable, like something about to snap, and Derek mistook that silence for victory. He adjusted his cufflinks, glancing briefly at the small cluster of onlookers who had paused their conversations just long enough to witness what he believed was a routine moment of maintaining standards. "We pride ourselves on efficiency here," he continued, his voice smooth but edged with quiet dismissal. "So we try to focus our time on clients who are ready to make serious purchases." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. Claire lowered her gaze for a brief second, not in submission, but in thought, as if she were measuring something far more important than the situation itself. When she looked back, up, her eyes were calm, steady, and entirely unshaken. "And what qualifies someone as serious?" she asked, her tone polite, almost curious. Derek blinked, slightly thrown off by the question. He was used to defensiveness, to awkward laughter, to people backing down. But not this. Not composure. He let out a short breath, forcing a thin smile. Typically, clients who understand the process. Appointments, financial verification, appropriate expectations. The last phrase lingered, heavier than the rest. Claire nodded slowly, as if accepting the explanation at face value. Around them, the showroom seemed to return to motion, but not fully. Conversations resumed in lower tones, glances still drifting back toward her, curiosity mixing with quiet judgment. Ethan remained a few steps away, shifting his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable but unsure if he should intervene again. Claire turned her head slightly, her gaze passing over the SUV once more, taking in the details she had already noticed the moment she walked in, the stitching on the leather seats, the precision of the body lines, the subtle reflection of light across the hood. Then she looked back at Derek. "I see," she said simply. There was no argument, no raised voice, no attempt to prove anything, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that made the moment heavier. Derek gave a small nod, satisfied, already preparing to move on. "If you would like, I can have someone show you our certified pre-owned selection. We have excellent vehicles that might better align with your needs." The phrase landed again, louder this time, drawing another ripple of attention. Claire's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not sarcastic, not bitter, just knowing. "That will not be necessary," she replied. Her voice was soft, but it carried. Derek hesitated for half a second, something in her tone brushing against his confidence, but he quickly dismissed it. People like her always left at this point. That was how these situations ended. Quietly, predictably. He stepped back slightly, already turning his body away. "Very well," he said. "Have a nice day." But Claire did not move. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and glanced at the screen for a moment. Her fingers moved with deliberate calm as she typed a single message. She did not rush. She did not hide it. And when she finished, she looked up again, not at Derek, but at the showroom itself, as if she were seeing it from an entirely different perspective now. The seconds that followed felt longer than they should have. Derek took 2 steps away, then slowed, something faint and unfamiliar tugging at the edge of his awareness. Behind him, one of the large glass doors reflected the movement outside, a dark shape pulling into the front drive. At first, it was just another car. Another arrival. Nothing unusual for a place like this. But then the vehicle stopped directly at the entrance. Not in a parking spot. Not in the loading area. Right at the front. Ethan noticed it first, his posture straightening slightly as he glanced toward the door. A security guard near the entrance shifted his stance. The subtle rhythm of the showroom changed again, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, attention drifting once more. Derek turned his head, irritation flickering briefly across his face at the interruption. He did not yet understand why the air felt different. He did not yet understand that the moment he believed had already ended was only just beginning. And Claire, still standing exactly where she had been, simply waited. The moment the car door opened, the atmosphere inside Bennett Luxury Motors shifted in a way that no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. It was not loud, not dramatic, not chaotic, just a quiet change in gravity, as if the room itself had suddenly decided to pay attention. The low hum of conversation faded into a hesitant silence. Heads turned, one after another, drawn toward the entrance by something instinctive rather than obvious. The man who stepped out of the sleek black sedan did not rush. He moved with a controlled, measured pace, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be noticed. His suit was perfectly tailored, dark navy, sharp lines, understated but unmistakably expensive. His posture was straight, his expression calm, but there was something in his presence that made people straighten unconsciously as he passed. Ethan felt at first a subtle tightening in his chest, the sudden realization that this was not just another customer. The security guard near the door shifted his stance immediately, offering a respectful nod without being asked. Even the polished marble floor seemed to echo differently under the man's steps. Derek, still standing a few feet away, narrowed his eyes slightly, trying to place the figure. Now walking through the glass doors. There was something familiar, something important, but his mind had not yet caught up. He adjusted his jacket again, instinctively preparing himself, though he could not yet explain why. The man's gaze moved across the showroom, quick, precise, taking in the layout, the staff, the subtle tension that lingered in the air. And then, without hesitation, his eyes found Claire. Everything else disappeared. He walked straight toward her, each step steady, deliberate, as if the distance between them was the only thing that mattered. Conversations stopped completely now. The room held its breath. Claire did not move. She did not wave, did not call out, did not signal. She simply waited, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if this moment had always been inevitable. When the man reached her, he did something that seemed small, almost insignificant, but in that room, it carried weight beyond measure. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture natural, familiar, undeniable. "Claire," he said softly, his voice calm but carrying through the silence. "Is everything all right?" It was not a question asked out of uncertainty. It was a question asked with authority, with expectation, with quiet control. And in that instant, Derek felt something cold settle in his stomach. Because he knew that voice, not from a casual meeting, not from a distant introduction, but from boardrooms, from quarterly reports, from the rare moments when the true owner of the company appeared and everything shifted around him. William Bennett. The name hit him before he could stop it. His throat tightened. His posture stiffened. The confidence that had filled him just moments ago drained away, replaced by a slow, creeping realization that spread across his face like a shadow. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Around him, the staff reacted in subtle but telling ways. One employee straightened immediately. Another stepped back. Ethan's eyes widened as understanding dawned, his gaze flicking between Claire and William, the connection now impossible to miss. Claire turned her head slightly toward William, her expression softening just a fraction, not into relief, not into triumph, but into something quieter, something grounded. "I asked for a test drive," she said simply. No accusation, no exaggeration, just the truth. William's eyes shifted, slowly, deliberately, until they landed on Derek. And that was the moment everything stopped. The room did. Not just go quiet. It froze. Derek stood there, caught between the man he had just dismissed as irrelevant and the reality now standing directly in front of him. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could undo what had already been done. But there was nothing. Because some mistakes do not happen in noise. They happen in moments of certainty. And by the time the truth arrives, it is already too late. No one spoke, because no one needed to. The answer was already written across Derek's face as clearly as if someone had said it out loud. William Bennett did not raise his voice, did not step forward aggressively, did not make a scene, and somehow that made it worse. His hand remained lightly on Claire's shoulder, steady, grounding, while his gaze held Derek in place with quiet authority. "You said she could not test drive the vehicle," William continued, his tone calm, almost conversational, but every word landed with precision. Derek swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Sir, I was simply following standard procedure," he managed, though the confidence in his voice had completely vanished. The sentence felt thin even as he said it. Around them, the showroom had gone completely still. Even the faint background music seemed to fade into nothing. Ethan stood frozen a few feet away, his hands clasped tightly, watching the moment unfold with a mixture of disbelief and dawning understanding. William tilted his head slightly, considering Derek's words, not interrupting, not rushing, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the discomfort settle deeper. "Standard procedure," he repeated quietly. "Explain it to me." The request was simple, but it carried weight. Derek opened his mouth, then paused. For the first time, he seemed unsure of the very rules he had just defended so confidently. We prioritize clients who meet certain criteria," he said, choosing each word carefully, as if hoping they would somehow fix what had already been broken. William's expression did not change. "And what criteria did my wife fail to meet?" The word landed harder than anything else. "My wife." It echoed through the room, undeniable, irreversible. A subtle shift rippled through the staff. One employee looked down immediately. Another took a step back, as if distance might offer protection. Derek's face lost what little color remained. "I did not realize," he began, but William raised a hand slightly, not sharply, just enough to stop him. "That is the problem," William said. His voice remained level, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it now, something that left no room for misunderstanding. You made a decision without realizing. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Claire remained still, her expression composed, her presence steady beside him. She did not step forward, did not interrupt, did not need to. The moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about revealing what had already been exposed. William took a slow breath, his gaze briefly shifting across the showroom, taking in the employees, the customers, the silent witnesses who had just watched a judgment form and collapse in the span of minutes. This company was built on a very simple principle, he continued, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room. Respect is not based on appearance. It is based on how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. The words settled into the space, quiet but unshakable. Derek lowered his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him from all sides. There was no argument left, no explanation that could undo what had been said, what had been seen. "Sir, I apologize," he said finally, the words coming out slower than he intended. It was a misunderstanding. William looked at him for a long second, not reacting immediately, as if measuring something deeper than the apology itself. Then he nodded once, but the gesture carried no relief. "It was not a misunderstanding," he replied calmly. "It was a choice." And in that moment, the difference between the two became impossible to ignore. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of realization, of something undeniable settling into place. Claire glanced briefly at William, then back at Derek, her gaze steady, not unkind, but clear. The situation had shifted completely, but she had not. She stood exactly as she had before, grounded, composed, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded around her. And that, more than anything else, made the lesson impossible to forget. The weight of William's words did not fade. It settled deeper, pressing into every corner of the showroom until even the smallest movement felt deliberate, measured, observed. Derek stood there, no longer the confident gatekeeper of who belonged and who did not, but a man suddenly aware that every decision he had made in the past few minutes was now being examined under a different light. He shifted his stance slightly, as if trying to regain control, but there was nothing left to control. The moment had already passed him. William's gaze did not leave him, calm but unwavering, like someone who had already reached a conclusion and was simply allowing time for it to be understood. "How long have you been managing this location?" William asked, his tone returning to something almost neutral, but the question carried weight far beyond its simplicity. Derek hesitated for a fraction of a second. 3 years, sir," he replied. 3 years, William repeated softly, as if placing the number into a larger context. "And in those 3 years, how many clients have you decided were not worth your time before you knew who they were?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Derek opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no number he could give, no answer that would not expose the truth behind the way he had been operating. Around them, the staff remained completely still, each person silently reflecting on their own role, their own choices, their own moments of quiet judgment. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. He had seen it before. He had just never seen it called out like this. Claire watched quietly, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had already moved beyond the moment itself and was observing what it revealed about everyone involved. William let the silence stretch again, not rushing to fill it, allowing Derek to feel the full weight of the question he could not answer. "This is not about a test drive," William said finally, his voice calm but firm. "And it is not about a single interaction." He took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment more direct, more personal. "It is about a pattern, a way of thinking that does not belong in a company that serves people, all people." Derek's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in his posture giving way to something closer to resignation. "I understand," he said quietly, though it was clear he was only beginning to. William studied him for a moment, then nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. "Understanding is a start," he replied, "but it does not erase the impact." The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. They were precise, and that made them impossible to ignore. A subtle movement came from the edge of the room as one of the senior staff members stepped closer, drawn in by the gravity of the situation, but still careful not to interrupt. The entire showroom had become a single point of focus, every eye fixed on the quiet exchange unfolding at its center. Claire shifted her weight slightly, the first small movement she had made in several minutes, and gently removed William's hand from her shoulder, not to distance herself, but to step forward on her own terms. Her gaze moved to Derek, steady, clear, not unkind, but unmistakably direct. "I did not come here to prove anything," she said softly. "I came here because I liked the car." The simplicity of the statement cut through the tension in a way nothing else had. It stripped the moment down to its core, revealing how unnecessary everything else had been. Derek nodded slowly, his expression no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, but something closer to humbled awareness. "I see that now," he said, his voice quieter than before. Claire held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting the acknowledgement without needing anything more. William looked between them, then turned slightly, his attention shifting beyond Derek, beyond the immediate moment, toward the broader space, the people, the system that had allowed this to happen so easily. "This location will be reviewed," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the staff to hear. Not to assign blame, but to correct what has been overlooked. The statement was calm, measured, but it carried the kind of finality that left no room for doubt. The room remained silent, but it was no longer tense. It was reflective, the kind of silence that follows when something important has been made clear. And in the center of it all, Claire stood exactly as she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, and quietly reminding everyone that the way you treat someone when you think it does not matter is exactly when it matters most. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this do not simply end. They settle, they echo, they change the way people see things long after the words are spoken. William's statement lingered in the air, not as a threat, but as a quiet certainty that something deeper had just been exposed. Derek remained still, his usual confidence replaced by a kind of awareness he had not carried before, the realization that the authority he thought he held was smaller than the responsibility he had been given. Across the showroom, employees exchanged brief glances, subtle shifts of posture revealing a shared understanding that this was not just about one mistake, but about a culture that had quietly taken root over time. Ethan finally took a step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, but purposeful. He approached Claire with a calm respect that had been present from the beginning, now more visible than ever. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you are still interested, I would be honored to walk you through the vehicle and arrange a test drive." His voice was steady, sincere, untouched by the tension that had just filled the room. Claire turned toward him, her expression softening slightly, not because of what had happened, but because of how he had chosen to respond to it. "Thank you," she replied, her tone warm but composed. "I would appreciate that." The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than anything else that had been said. It restored something that had been missing just moments before. William watched the interaction quietly, his gaze thoughtful, observing not just the outcome, but the choices that led to it. He gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if marking a point of balance returning to the room. Derek remained where he was, his hands now resting at his sides, his posture no longer rigid, but grounded in a different way. He glanced briefly at Ethan, then back at Claire, as if seeing both of them more clearly than before. There was no interruption, no attempt to reclaim control, no effort to rewrite the moment. Instead, he stepped back, just slightly, allowing space where before he had taken it. Claire followed Ethan toward the vehicle, her steps calm, unhurried, as if nothing about her pace had ever changed. The SUV stood exactly where it had been, unchanged, untouched by the tension that had surrounded it, its polished surface reflecting the lights above and the quiet shift happening below. Ethan opened the door for her, not with exaggerated formality, but with genuine respect. "It has a 3.0-liter engine," he began, his voice steady, professional, but now layered with something more authentic. "Smooth handling, advanced safety features, and a very comfortable interior for long drives." Claire listened, her attention focused, her interest real, as it had been from the start. She stepped closer, running her hand lightly along the edge of the door, taking in the details she had noticed before, now without distraction. Behind them, William remained where he was, his presence no longer dominating the room, but still anchoring it. He turned his head slightly, his gaze moving across the staff, not in judgment, but in expectation. The message had already been delivered. What mattered now was what would be done with it. A senior staff member approached him quietly, speaking in low tones, but William simply nodded once, his attention already shifting forward. Derek watched from a distance, not excluded, but no longer at the center. His expression had changed, the sharp edges of certainty replaced by something more reflective, something that suggested the beginning of understanding rather than the end of it. And as Claire settled into the driver's seat, adjusting it slightly, placing her hands on the steering wheel with quiet familiarity, the room seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in recognition. Because the moment had not been about power. It had been about perception. And now, that perception had been rewritten in a way no one present would forget. The engine started with a low, refined hum, barely louder than a breath, and yet it carried a presence that filled the space in a way no raised voice ever could. Claire adjusted her seat slightly, her hands resting naturally on the steering wheel, as if she had done this countless times before, not in this exact vehicle, but in moments where control was never something she had to prove. Ethan stood just outside the open driver's door, explaining the final details with a steady professionalism that now came from genuine respect rather than routine training. You will notice the steering response is very precise, especially at lower speeds, he said, his tone calm, his words measured. It is designed to feel effortless, even in tight spaces. Claire gave a small nod, her attention focused, her expression thoughtful, as if she were already imagining the drive beyond the showroom walls. Behind them, the rest of the dealership remained unusually quiet, not out of tension anymore, but out of awareness. Conversations had not fully resumed, movements were more deliberate, and every action carried a subtle understanding that something important had just shifted. William stood a few steps back, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer commanding the room, but still anchoring it. His eyes followed Claire for a moment, then moved across the floor, taking in the staff, the space, the unspoken recalibration happening in real time. Derek remained near the edge of the scene, no longer at the center, but not removed either. His gaze rested on Claire as she settled into the seat, and for the first time, there was no judgment in it, no quick assessment, no assumption. Only observation, only reflection. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving Claire space as she gently pressed the accelerator. The vehicle rolled forward smoothly, the movement controlled, almost silent, as it glided across the polished floor toward the open exit. The sunlight outside stretched across the hood, catching the metallic finish and reflecting it back into the showroom like a quiet reminder of everything that had just happened inside. Claire guided the vehicle toward the driveway, her movements precise but unhurried, completely at ease. There was no urgency in her actions, no need to prove anything through speed or performance. The moment itself had already spoken louder than any demonstration could. As the SUV reached the entrance, the security guard stepped aside immediately, his posture respectful, his eyes following the vehicle as it passed. Outside, the world continued as it always had, traffic moving, people walking, the ordinary rhythm of the day unchanged. And yet, inside the showroom, everything felt different. Ethan watched the vehicle disappear onto the street, a quiet sense of clarity settling over him. He turned slightly, his gaze meeting William's for a brief moment. There was no need for words. The acknowledgement was enough. William gave a small nod, subtle but deliberate, before shifting his attention away, his focus already moving toward what would come next. Derek remained still for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding. He glanced around the showroom, seeing it now not as a place he controlled, but as a place he was responsible for. The difference was quiet, but it was absolute. When Claire returned several minutes later, the SUV gliding back into the driveway with the same calm precision, the room did not tense again. It did not need to. The lesson had already been learned. Ethan stepped forward as she parked, opening the door with the same steady respect as before. Claire stepped out, her expression composed, her presence unchanged from the moment she had first walked in. She looked at the vehicle once more, then back at Ethan. "It drives beautifully," she said softly. And in that simple statement, there was no trace of what had happened earlier, no lingering tension, no need to revisit it. Because for her, the moment had never been about the car. It had been about something far more important. Something the entire room now understood without a single word being spoken. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they were sincere, and sincerity had a way of cutting deeper than any confrontation. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging her feedback, but there was something else in his expression now, something quieter, something thoughtful. "I am glad to hear that," he replied, his voice steady, though his eyes briefly flickered toward William, as if understanding the weight of what this moment truly represented. Claire stepped away from the vehicle, her hand brushing lightly along the door as it closed with a soft, controlled click. The sound echoed faintly across the showroom, a final note that seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. William approached slowly, not to take over the moment, but to stand beside her, his presence calm, grounded, no longer a force that shifted the room, but a steady anchor within it. "What do you think?" he asked, his tone softer now, more personal, the authority still there but no longer directed outward. Claire glanced at him briefly, then back at the vehicle. "It is exactly what I expected," she said. The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. William nodded once, then turned slightly toward Ethan. "We will take it," he said, not as a grand declaration, but as a natural conclusion. The words moved through the room like a quiet wave. Not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture reflecting both professionalism and something closer to pride. "Of course, sir," he replied. "I will begin the paperwork immediately." Derek, standing a few steps away, felt the weight of that sentence more than anyone else. Not because of the sale itself, but because of what it represented. The transaction he had dismissed, the opportunity he had nearly turned away, the moment he had misjudged entirely. He took a slow breath, then stepped forward, not out of obligation, but because something in him understood that remaining silent would only deepen the distance between who he had been and who he needed to become. "Mrs. Bennet," he said carefully, his voice steady but no longer carrying the sharp edge it once had. Claire turned toward him, her expression neutral, attentive, open but not inviting more than what was offered. Derek held her gaze for a brief moment, then continued. "I owe you an apology." The words were simple, but this time they were not rushed, not defensive, not an attempt to move past the moment. They were deliberate. "I made an assumption that I should not have made, and I treated you in a way that does not reflect the standards of this place." The room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that allowed space for honesty instead of tension. Claire listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. When Derek finished, she did not respond immediately. She let the moment settle, just long enough to make it real. "Thank you for saying that," she replied finally, her tone calm, measured. "Just make sure it is not something you have to say again." The sentence was not harsh, but it carried a clarity that made it more powerful than any reprimand. Derek nodded slowly, the message landing fully this time. "It will not be," he said quietly. William observed the exchange without stepping in, his gaze thoughtful, recognizing that this was not his moment to control, but hers to define. And she had done so without raising her voice, without demanding anything, without needing to assert power in the way most people would. Around them, the showroom seemed to breathe again, the tension dissolving into something more grounded, more aware. Employees began to move, not with the casual rhythm from before, but with a heightened sense of purpose, as if each action now carried meaning. Ethan returned with a tablet, ready to finalize the process, his movements efficient but respectful. Claire accepted it, reviewing the details with the same calm focus she had carried from the beginning. Nothing about her pace changed. Nothing about her demeanor shifted. Because for her, this had never been about proving who she was. It had been about showing who she had always been. And as the final details were prepared, and the moment settled into its quiet conclusion, one thing remained unmistakably clear to everyone in the room. Respect is not something you give based on what you see. It is something you choose before you know anything at all. The final signatures were completed without urgency, each stroke of the pen calm, deliberate, as if the moment did not need to be rushed to feel complete. Claire handed the tablet back to Ethan with a small nod, her expression unchanged, steady as it had been from the moment she first stepped through the glass doors. Nothing about her demeanor suggested triumph, and yet the entire room understood that something significant had just taken place. Not a victory over a person, but a quiet correction of something deeper. William stood beside her, his posture relaxed, no longer the center of attention, but still carrying the quiet authority of someone who had already said everything that needed to be said. Derek remained a few steps back, watching, not with the guarded defensiveness he once had, but with a kind of clarity that only comes after a mistake has been fully seen. He did not interrupt again. He did not try to add anything more, because he understood now that the lesson was not in what he could say next, but in what he would choose to do differently moving forward. Around them, the showroom had returned to motion, but it was not the same motion as before. There was a subtle shift in how people spoke, how they approached, how they looked at each person who walked through the door. It was not dramatic. It was not forced, but it was real. A recalibration that would not be forgotten by the end of the day. Claire turned slightly, her eyes moving once more across the space, not searching, not judging, just observing. For a brief moment, her gaze met Derek's again. There was no resentment in it, no lingering tension, just acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, there was something far more powerful than forgiveness. There was closure. Ethan stepped forward again, handing her the keys with both hands, a gesture small but filled with respect. "Everything is ready, ma'am," he said. Claire accepted them with a soft, "Thank you," her voice quiet but clear. William gave Ethan a brief nod as well, a silent recognition of the way he had handled himself when it mattered. Outside, the sunlight had shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the driveway. The SUV waited, polished and still, no different than it had been before, and yet now it carried a story that no one could see, but everyone inside would remember. Claire walked toward it at the same unhurried pace, William beside her, not leading, not following, simply there. As the doors opened and closed behind them, the showroom settled into a new kind of quiet, one that did not come from tension, but from understanding. Derek remained where he was for a moment longer, then slowly turned, his eyes scanning the floor, not as a manager enforcing standards, but as someone reconsidering what those standards truly meant. He adjusted his jacket, not out of habit this time, but as if preparing himself for something different, something better. And somewhere in that quiet shift, something had changed that could not be undone. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons are not delivered through confrontation, but through contrast. Not through anger, but through dignity. Not through force, but through presence. And that day, in a place built on appearances, everyone was reminded of something far more important. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.